My name is Roger Harnden. I'm here today, in a small cottage deep in rural Wales, with Professor Stafford Beer. Stafford has agreed to respond to the written questions that were submitted to us at the time of the Liverpool masterclass on the 22nd of May. Before we start, I have 3 apologies to make to those individuals who took the trouble to submit questions. Firstly, that there wasn't the time and space to answer on the day itself. Secondly, there are a couple of questions specifically addressed to Michael Benelli. For logistical reasons, we haven't been able to include his response on this tape. Thirdly, a couple of the questioners submitted several questions without prioritizing them. We've taken the liberty of choosing the one we like best. Right then, Stafford. Shirley Blenkinsop of Loughborough University and Jeff Royston, Department of Health, both address the problem of turning theory into practice. For Jeff, the VSM has led to valuable clarification of issues, but such clarification has proved difficult to follow up with specific projects. Have you any tips along these lines?
Well, I can only say my books are full of the tips. I've never developed theory on its own. I've always developed theory in harmony with practice, and there's been a constant interaction of the two all my life. And I've tried to put these tips, as you call them, into the books. And I often find that people sort of gloss over the examples I give, stick with the theory, and then say afterwards, I have reduced this to absurdity, and my God, it's absurd, which is a bit unfair. So I would say, please look at the examples in my 3 books on the VSM and in Raul Espejo and Roger Harden's edited example, where there are lots of applications listed, and try and see through the theory into the practice. I suppose if I were asked to give one example, I would pick on, from that last book, the application that I did to an insurance company, which has not neglected the most diabolically tricky political issues of the situation I was in. And I must tell you that I was quite amazed that the company concerned, after something like 10 or more years of this intervention with the VSM, were not only amenable but actually proud to be presented as the company to which this was applied. And there's nothing very theoretical about that. Well, there is everything theoretical about it, but the way it's presented in what I've written is quite clearly a real-life situation full of politics, full of human interaction.
Thank you, Stafford. There's an associated question from Shirley Blenkinsop. She considers whether the VSM be used as a diagnostic tool or a medium for learning about organizational effectiveness. In other words, as a micro-world.
Oh, it's quite clear to me. You use it for whatever is convenient to use it. It's certainly a diagnostic tool. It's certainly a learning instrument, to take the questioner's 2 key points. What I wouldn't like it used at is some kind of prescription, because prescriptions have to have content, and this is a way of looking at a world with which you are confronted.
Fine. Right. The third question is a series of questions, really. A variety of the questioners touch on the issue of conflict, instability, and chaos, as in chaos theory. I think these questions fall along 3 main lines. I'll return to these, Stafford, but I'll give you the 3 lines first. Firstly, there's the suggestion that if we consider instability or chaos as providing the space for the emergence of renewal mechanisms for organizational effectiveness, then damping, far from providing stability, might be an inhibitor and a liability. The second point is that there are a couple of questions asking about the precise way in which individuals with conflicting interests might be persuaded to compromise for the sake of the interests of the organisation as a whole. And lastly in the set, in the theme of conflict, there's the suggestion that an unresolved ambiguity of purpose might be beneficial, for example, by promoting insight into tolerance. These questions have been grouped from the following individuals: B. Marsh of Shell, Jeff Hutt of AT&T Istel, J. Marichel, and Robin Wood of the London Business School. Now I'll return to them each in turn, Stafford. Under conflict, the first point is that if we do accept, as seems to be the case, that instability and chaos can give rise to renewal mechanisms, to the emergence of novelty, then the problem with damping, as in System 2, as it sometimes appears, it seems to be that damping could be pathological or an inhibitor rather than just a provider of stability.
Yes, these three questions are all very shrewd, and I feel very comfortable with them. Let's take this first one. What the questioners say is exactly true, but it's quite strange to me. The model precisely answers this question itself. Now, System 2 is a damping machinery to deal with conflicts between Systems 1. That's all. Right? So we are looking at a way of stopping oscillation inside the existing system. Now, when you start talking about adaptability, as I would call it, I don't think that was the word the questioners used, we are talking explicitly about System 4. Now, if you have a System 2 being adaptable when its only job is to resolve conflict between existing Systems 1, then you are going to be in deep trouble, because there is no adaptability involved there. It is a damping mechanism, that's what it's there for, and it damps. Now, if System 4 is working, there is no question of damping, there is a question, on the contrary, of amplifying every single indication of change, examining it, reinforcing it if it is valuable to the survival of the organism, and tending to eliminate it if it isn't. Now, that isn't damping in the sense of System 2. So the damping in the sense of System 2 it comes from servo mechanics. It is entirely a question of stopping juddering in the system. Whereas adaptability in System 4 is a question of recognizing opportunity, learning, and reinforcing what is valuable to survival.
Right, I think that's quite clear, Stafford, and perhaps now I'll reorder the other two questions, because maybe what you've said just now bears straight onto the third question, which was unresolved ambiguity of purpose might be beneficial, for example, by promoting insight into tolerance.
Yes, I think this is absolutely true. I have written a great deal about the dangers of classificatory systems, of the normal human propensity to deal with exploding variety by saying, oh, this is a case of that. Doctors do it all the time, lawyers do it all the time. It's a very professional trick. Now, I would advocate a caution about classifying inputs coming into System 4 from the big outside world, from the scenarios of the future that we all try to construct, and to ask ourselves what exactly is going on here, and am I right to classify it like this, or shall I preserve the ambiguity because I don't know what the future holds? I am a great proponent of ambiguity. It's partly because I'm as interested in art as I am in science. The potency of poetry and of painting quite clearly has to do with this very ambiguity. And I think that an understanding of the future has to have the same kind of feel about it. most of the mistakes, after all, that we have made in trying to adapt to the future in our kind of age and civilization have been entirely due to misclassifying what was going on, in my opinion.
Fine. Does that again lead on to, Stafford, the third strand in this question of conflict, which concerns how individuals with conflicting interests might be persuaded to compromise for the sake of the interests of the organisation as a whole? Perhaps what you've just said casts a slightly different light on the direction of this question.
Yes, it contributes to it, because after all, we are not in the business of trying to kill everybody who disagrees with us, or we oughtn't to be. Life is complex. Nobody has the correct, unquote, answers, because there are no such things. We have to chart a course which is as adaptable as possible to the risks that we run, inevitably, of being damn well wrong, which so few people will admit that they might be in the way we conduct our affairs. So what I am advocating here is that we look to conflict resolution mechanisms, and there are many of them, and I have contributed this myself, and I don't think that there's time to go into the precise ways in which I have been advocating conflict resolution, but it is always not as a consensus, as the popular word has it, which I believe takes us to the lowest common denominator and is more or less worthless, because it takes any spice, any excitement out of things. What we are looking for is a course that people will go along while preserving their conflicts in a civilized fashion, in order to say, there you are, you see, doesn't that support what I have been saying all along, rather than saying, you were wrong, I was right, let's have an election and change all over. It is a much more subtle process than that, and it is a very creative process if properly handled, and I believe it can be properly handled, Roger.
Great, Stafford. Now, Robin Wood of the London Business School wonders whether an exception to the VSM might occur when the system itself has greater variety than the environment.
That's a very entertaining question, because obviously, I think obviously it shouldn't have. So what Mr. Wood is considering is essentially a cancerous kind of system to begin with, isn't it? But of course this doesn't mean the question is silly, because we've got many of those, and it's normally called bureaucracy. And we do have many bureaucracies which are more complicated than the system they're trying to control. A very favourite example of mine was discovered in Canada. There was a notorious explosion of an ammunition ship in the First World War in the harbour at Halifax. And the benign government of Canada, and they are pretty benign, set up a whole organisation to look after the dependents of this disaster. And it was discovered by, I think it was Kenneth Galbraith. But if it wasn't, it was someone of equal eminence, still to be in existence in the 50s. And the gentleman asked the question, how many dependents do we still have of this disaster? And of course there weren't any, and I'm so sorry I've forgotten the numbers, because it suits the question so well, this example. A huge number of people were employed administering a fund that wasn't going anywhere. And the answer appeared to be that the Canadian government, in pursuit of its bilingualism policy, had ruled that the numbers of civil servants who were French and English speaking must be equivalent, and mirabile dictu, all the French-speaking civil servants had ended up in this bogus and highly complex piece of machinery that wasn't doing anything. So, joking apart, well, that wasn't a joke, it's a true story, but getting absolutely to the root of the question, I would think that if you find this situation, the answer is kill it. because it can't possibly be doing the right thing. It's got to be cancerous. So what I would do is make a variety analysis, and I would say, let us try and get a feel for the variety we're trying to control, and then ask ourselves why the controlling variety is much greater, and extirpate it.
Fine. A question submitted before the day by David Sutton of System 6 and endorsed by Chris Russ of Dunstan Green and Company pointed out that the VSM is unlikely to be the only systems approach used by an analyst. In fact, Stafford, I think that Michael Benelli demonstrated this precise point on the day. But would you like to comment on any situation that you can think of for which the VSM is not specifically useful or relevant? Further, in such circumstances, what other tools would you yourself incorporate into your total approach?
Yes, I think this is true, and the very simplest, this sounds a simplistic answer, but I believe it's the correct one, is that systems which are not intended to be viable systems should not be analysed by the viable system model. Now, there are millions of these. There are millions of systems that are set up to do a job and are never intended to be survival worthy. And indeed, we get into a pathological situation every time such a system is found to be trying to prolong its own life, as in the case of the Halifax disaster that I just happened to have mentioned. So what, you ask me, what tools do you use? Well, I say I use the tools of cybernetic analysis. Now, it was the use of those tools which led me to develop the viable system model for viable systems. In the case of systems that aren't supposed to be surviving, but are supposed to be doing a job, I use exactly the same basic tools of drawing the system as a kind of flowchart in the most inventive way possible. I think, by the way, if I can put this in brackets, that the development of very formal arrangements for drawing computer systems, with boxes and funny shapes and oblongs and so forth, has much restricted people's awareness that they can draw a system any damn way they like, with arrows all over the place and boxes of their own design. So that's what I do. If I'm confronted with a system that isn't meant to be viable, I lie on the floor in my hotel bedroom, usually with huge sheets of paper, and try and work out how this thing is supposed to work. And again, if I may say so, there are many examples of this in my publications. The Will of the People springs to mind for some unknown reason. It's a paper in the Operation Research Journal where I tried to analyse, by no means using the VSM, what happens when the media try to operate and the public is trying to understand a so-called real-life situation. That's the general approach I use. And I think the biggest tip here is to ask what you think the system is supposed to be doing if its primary preoccupation is not to be a viable system. It has been set up for some reason. Is it fulfilling that function? Very likely it isn't. Very likely it's pursuing its own ends, and very likely it's trying to turn itself into a viable system, in which case, as I've said earlier, it is in a pathological condition.
Right. Passing on to Michael Branson of Clarendon Consultants and Jeff Royston, Department of Health. They both consider the manner in which functional departments such as marketing, purchasing, computing, are denied viability, in other words autonomy, in the terms of the viable system model. Now, first point, Michael suggests that a successful functional department will already in fact manifest all 5 systems. What do you say to that, Stafford?
Well, I don't think it will, Michael. I know Michael. I believe that the functional departments, as defined, exists on the lines connecting the boxes in the VSM. Marketing is clearly something that's happening on the loop, the homeostatic loop connecting production and the environment, for example. So you find them on the lines. Now, if you start erecting viable systems on the lines, then you sure as hell are in trouble because of this question of what I have often called pathological autopoiesis. This is to say that people are trying to make themselves survival worthy when they are there, witness the word, to be a function, not to be an entity. Now, if we then ask, well, how is it, as Michael correctly says, of course, that some such shows do manifest viability in the sense of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the odds are that we are dealing with something which, by definition, could be hived off, and therefore, by definition, could be hived in. In other words, if you didn't have this function, you could hire it. And the person you would hire it from, the entity you would hire it from, would be a viable system. It would be a company that sells that kind of function. So you hire it in. But the whole thing is to keep the focus of the system in focus. That's why I used that term. From the point of view of the system in focus, the functional departments are simply fulfilling a function. From some wider perspective, they might be called into being from outside viable systems, and many is the time, conversely, we have seen that internal functions can be sold outside, in which case they better be viable systems from that point of view, from that system in focus. And the obvious example here is a computer bureau which was set up inside the company to do the company's in-house computing, found to be spending an awful lot of money, and asked to try and recoup that money by acting as a bureau to the outside world. And if it starts doing that, then it had better damn well be a viable system. But that won't alter the fact at all that from the analysis we are making of the system in focus, that's a red herring. The function is the function, not to be survival worthy, but to do the job on the lines. I mean literally on the lines drawn between boxes in the VSM for the company or organisation we have under review.
That seems again to the second point I was going to focus on, Stafford, was Jeff Royston's point, and perhaps you were leading up to that in a way, or perhaps you've already anticipated it. Jeff is pointing out that with the increase of customer contract principles within organisations, that perhaps there is a blur of what he sees as the stress of non-viability vis-à-vis functional departments.
Oh yes. Well, I have sort of anticipated that, haven't I? I think it's extremely important to... I'm glad I invented this phrase, the system in focus. It's very important to know what you're talking about at any given time. And that sounds trivial, but it isn't. Anybody who's sat on a management meeting or a board knows how the conversation rapidly turns to whatever it is that people know about or are interested in or find emotive, rather than the thing they're supposed to be discussing. And they ride up and down several levels of recursion with the greatest ease. The man who first spotted this and made it dramatic, of course, was Northcote Parkinson with Parkinson's laws, where he saw that if you were supposed to be discussing, for instance, the installation of a nuclear furnace of some kind, what's the word I want, Roger?
Reactor?
Yes. Well, never mind. A huge, complicated system. You find yourself talking about the bicycle shed or the tea breaks for the office boy because that's something you could handle, and you couldn't handle the nuclear reactor, or the big computer for that matter, which is a much more practical example. So I think that focusing on the question you are addressing is crucial, not only for the manager, which is what I was just talking about, but of course for the analyst. It is very easy to get distracted and analyse the wrong thing. And as soon as we use words like functional and all the other key words in the management vocabulary, we are likely to get distracted from analysing what is the system actually doing. You know, I've been much quoted from my apothegm, which says the purpose of the system is what it does, and I stick to that, because all sorts of hype and BS is thrown about what the system is alleged to be doing, what it's set up to do, what everybody claims it's doing, what people want bonuses for doing, all of that, and not noticing what it is actually doing, which is the only thing worth analysing.
Fine, I think that's clarified the point. Fine. We come now to Paul Stokes from Swansea University, who we're grateful for because he flooded us with provocative questions. Unfortunately, as I explained at the beginning, we had to pick just one, and the one we picked was the following. I quote, "Given that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, have there ever been any disasters as a direct consequence of the application of the VSM to an organisation?" How about that, Stafford?
Well, I'm thinking. No, I don't honestly think they have. Not within the compass of the applications that I've made or been associated with. The VSM has been used very widely without my knowledge at all, and I can't, of course, speak for those occasions. I'm talking hesitantly here because I don't really know whether to say what's in my mind, and I suppose it's best that I do, having already given the answer that I've given. By a very strange quirk of fate, I think that the very success of what we did in Chile was instrumental in bringing down the government. And that's, I'm sure, not what Mr. Stokes had in mind. But the fact is, and this may be of interest to the audience, that Allende was elected with 36%.
Excuse me, Stafford, was that President?
Yes, President Allende of Chile was elected in 1969, I think, with 36%. So he had a minority government, and it was perfectly democratic. He had an agreement with other parties, so he became president. Now, we applied the VSM on a very large scale through many recursions and so on, and all of that is recorded in the last 5 chapters of the second edition of Brain of the Firm.
This was to the whole nation, to the national economy?
We called it the social economy, yes. And Allende was very successful, and of course the machinery he was using, which we provided, was part of that success, but of course by no means all of it, by absolutely no means. But we facilitated the success whereby in March 1973 he became 46% in the elections. Now, the whole of the rich world were being told that he was a disaster, that his policies would be inflationary, and all the rest of it. I have never seen a more misrepresented thing in the media in all my life. It was outrageous. And, of course, had every conceivable political motive, because this was the first democratically elected Marxist in the history of man. Now, when he got within sight of 50%, you see, which after all would have given him absolute control, regardless of winning support from other parties, the CIA acted and moved in and destroyed the government and killed Allende. And when I used to say that 20 years ago, people said, hey, you can't prove this, and so on. But nowadays, that I wish you to know that is totally accepted. There has been a congressional inquiry into the way that the CIA behaved in Chile, and there's a 2-volume analysis on the record of Congress showing that this is exactly what happened. An institution called the 40 Committee, headed by a certain Dr. Kissinger, decided to destabilize Chile, which was their interesting word for this process, and that's what they did. So all I'm saying is that I'm glad to repeat this story, because there's a new generation growing up who believe what they're told by history books, I suppose. And it wasn't at all like that, and I've often felt that if we hadn't been so successful, Allende would still be alive, and the democratic government of Chile wouldn't have gone into decline for all those years. Of course, it now has a democracy again, thank God, and let's hope that it will restore itself and its civil liberties.
Thank you. We pass on now to questions from David Tan and Enrique Hernandez of British Telecom, both of whom are concerned about the matter of formalization of the model, in the sense that it appears that its application is most effective in inexact problem situations. Now, two questions seem to arise from this. The first is, how would one take advantage of the VSM to develop the architecture of technological systems in such a way as to better integrate such systems with social systems?
I'm not too sure that I understand the question, but I've met a question of this form many times before, so if I'm answering the wrong question, forgive me. But what I want to say is this, that you should not be using the VSM to examine IT itself, information technology. That isn't a viable system. The technology is there to instrument the viability of the organization that it informs. So what you should be doing, in my opinion, is analyzing the organization itself and observing that information technology and all those other things that are comparable are there, again I use the phrase on the lines, they are there to connect boxes together, not to be boxes. And one asks the question, therefore, to what extent does the operation of IT, let's just stick with that term, instrument, I think was the word I just used, the viability of the system of which it is a part. Now, once you've said that, you see, the question as posed is resolved, I think, because what was it, Roger, you said? Could you just give me the words again? The last bit.
The question was about developing an architecture of technological systems in a way that such technological systems might be better integrated with social systems.
Yes, thank you. You see, I'm saying that you don't have an architecture of the technological system, you have an architecture of the organism, of the organization. The resulting patterns that develop in the informational technology are a result of that. This being so, as I said, I thought I was right, the question about the social component dissolves, because obviously the total system, the organization we are addressing, consists of a bunch of people standing in social relationships, applying production technologies, let's say, or service technologies, whatever it is they're up to, and the informational component instruments this, is the word I keep using. There are a lot of other words that I would like to conjure up. Facilitates, makes smooth, all these kind of words of what that is about, and there is no dichotomy at all between technical and social systems when they are looked at as ways of examining a total organization. After all, let's remember that the technological instruments that we have at our command are just a function of the state of society that can invent, develop and implement them. They don't exist out there on their own. And I think that there is a fallacy lurking inside the question that suggests that they might. And given the way in which many leading technological companies have tried to take over the universe, it's not surprising to me that it looks like that. But that's not right, is it?
Now, David Tan and Enrique Hernandez are also preoccupied with the problematical term for them, variety. And they both appear to feel that Ross Ashby's law of requisite variety is slightly ambiguous. In this light, I'd like to give you the example that David quotes. He says, "A telephone system is large, has millions of states, and yet is not complex to the average user. It is complex, though, to a network manager." Would you like to comment on the matter of variety, Stafford? I'm not sure that...
Yes, I think this is very hard on Ross Ashby because I knew him awfully well. I loved him very much. And if he had a fault, it was that he was meticulous to the point where it drove you nuts. So to say that his account of variety is ambiguous is really quite awful to me. He defined variety as the number of possible states of a system. Now, you can't begin to count those states unless you can define the system unambiguously, and that's the point, isn't it, of the question. So there's nothing ambiguous about the definition of the term. What I feel people fail to realize is that although things are countable in principle, in other words, in mathematical terms, they're a denumerable set, you can't actually count most of them, but nor can you count denumerable sets in mathematics. It's a concept. And what one can say, quite certainly, in management situations, is that the variety of this is obviously a damn sight greater than the variety of that, and therefore we don't have a condition of requisite variety. What are we going to do about it? That is the kind of way I use it, but I don't call that ambiguity. I call it an inability to be exact. But then we do all manner of things on the basis of inexactitude. We accept a life in which probabilities play an overriding part in all our affairs, and we are content to go along on the basis that because this looks more probable than that, I will therefore act in this particular way. Now again, I've lost the second half of the question. Could you repeat the end of that?
Well, the end of it was the example that they gave of a telephone system.
Oh yes, thank you.
On the point of view of the user,
yes.
On the point of view of the...
Yes, I knew there was something else I wanted to say. Now, I think that the epistemology of this is the second equally important point. We have to see a system as a subjective thing, as something that includes the observer. Now, there is no such thing as a telephone system out there which is sitting there brooding. Either it's being used by the user or it's being managed by the manager, and what we have to make quite clear, I've said this several times in this recording, for one reason and another, we have to be sure what it is we're talking about. Now, as soon as you say, I am talking about requisite variety for a telephone system on the part of somebody who's sitting in a house with a telephone, you have a totally different analysis from the one you have where you say, well, I happen to be the manager of the or telephone company or the Minister of Communications or what the hell. The whole problem is different. The technology happens to be the same. Who cares? The managerial task has to do with closing the loop between the observer, which is in this case the user or the manager, and what is going on outside, which is telephones ringing or not ringing, fax machines being plugged in or not plugged in, and all the network that happens in between happens to be a completely different network in the two instances that our questioners raise, which is why they raise the question. But if it were perfectly clear that there is no objective reality which doesn't change between these two things, then they wouldn't have asked the question, I feel.
Yes, it's very interesting. Now, Stafford, Peter Bond of Liverpool Polytechnic poses a question that I feel might refer back to the problems you mentioned in Chile in a previous question. What Peter Bond asks is how System 5 might be susceptible to change. And he gives the example of the capitalist economic system.
This is a question of the utmost profundity and probably therefore of the utmost importance. I would like to say first that, of course, the VSM is a set of conventions. And if we're going to get the best out of using it in conversation or application, then let us be clear that we know what the conventions really are. Now, System 5, which is explicitly mentioned, has no direct outside connection to the observable world. You remember? The original model, everybody knows, was that of the central nervous system. The System 5 is in the cortex, the prefrontal lobe, essentially, which is the thing that you can affect if you give electric shocks or prefrontal leucotomies and things like this. It has no direct connection with the outside world. The connection comes through System 4. In physical terms, in the physiological terms, I should say, through the eyes and the ears and the other senses and the internal sense organs, is a System 4 function. So if we want to analyze this question correctly, we need to ask, we need to identify how we're using the terms. Now, it is the job of System 4, which has access to the outside world, to formulate models of the internal organization and the perceived environment, to examine the homeostat between those two, and then to admit into that scenario, into that simulation of a dynamic, the possible futures that can be read into the movements that are perceived in what we usually call the outside world. So that's how it all works. Now then, what about the homeostat between 4 and 5? 5 has no direct axis. It is using the information that it's getting from 4. Well, the 4 function has to do with making adaptation possible. But 5 has to do with the, may I say, ethics of that. For instance, if System 4 says, well, what we do is move in and kill everybody, System 5 may say, well, that may be a very good simulation of what is the best thing to do, but by God, we are in charge of the ethos, which begins to be ethics, of the organization, and we are not going to move in and kill anybody. We don't believe in that. Now, you know, we have some wonderful examples of this under our very nose at all times, because human society is what it is. We have recently had, in the Middle East, a situation where System 5 has been proclaiming ethical considerations and demanding that System 4 adapts to those, instead of listening to System 4's analysis and then asking what the ethics of System 5 has to make of that. I believe the whole thing has been turned on its head. And I had the extraordinary experience of watching the President of the United States on television saying that the invasion of Kuwait was the first moral problem that had been posed to the world since the Second World War. I just couldn't believe it. We have a third of the world starving at all times. Is that not a moral problem? Are the actions of the United States itself, may I dare say, all over the world in those years, not themselves constituted a moral problem? And now all this happens in the Gulf in order to restore oil rights, masquerading as the installation of a democracy, reinstallation of a democracy which never existed in the first place. Now, I can't help when an audience, even on tape, ask me for examples, and many people have complained, this is all very well in theory, what about practice? I am forced to give practical examples. And here we have a fascinating question where the practical examples are under our nose at all times. And the virtue of the VSM is to analyze those and stop standing things on their head and say, where do we collect information? What do we do with it? How do we process this in a 3-4 homeostat which says, this is what we think is likely to happen. What can we do about it within the status of the stuff we have, which is system 321, then goes to the 4-5 homeostat and says, hey, this is what looks like happening. What is our moral stance about this? That's how it should be. Now, I can give you an example, which is trivial compared with the Gulf War, but is non-trivial in the circumstances in which we had it. When I was development director in IPC, we bought a company. We were doing that all the time. I was instrumental in a great many buyouts. And this purchase was quite good, except that after we got it, it came home to us that we had a door-to-door salesman operation of rather dubious encyclopedias. Now, what do you do? It was quite remunerative. It's evident that under some ways of looking at the world, you say, oh, we've got some money here, that's nice. But on the 4-5 homeostat, I went to system 5 and I said, I submit that this is not moral. And I would like to close this down, but you are the bosses and you strike the ethical bargain. And thank God they agreed. I don't know what I would have done if they hadn't. We had a very similar example where women were being used to housebound women, that is to say mainly single-parent women, couldn't get to work and were doing, they were knowledgeable about computers and they were doing computer programming at home at cut-price rates. Now, do you allow that to happen on the grounds that it pays off? No, you don't. And then you are faced with all the ethical issues that if you close down that operation, there are a whole lot of one-parent women out there with no income who would probably rather that you screwed them to death in terms of economics than that they had no income at all. Well, all right, those are other issues, but insofar as the VSM is concerned, to try and pose those issues within the context of what makes the system viable, I believe is very, very powerful. And it stops people just slopping off into histrionics, hysterics, emotive appeals of all kinds, which is very easy to do.
Right, that's very comprehensive. Thank you.
You mean I've talked too much?
No, that was very interesting. Along slightly different lines, Stafford, Angus White of Strathclyde wonders whether the conversation and interpretation methodology of Fernando Flores and Terry Winograd, whether this methodology complements or is incommensurable with the viable system model.
Now, whenever I see a dichotomy, I always advocate killing it. Dichotomy is never right. You see, there's a sense in which it complements it, and a sense in which it is incommensurable with it, so why should I be forced to choose? If I say what my problem is with the Flores-Winograd system, it may help to answer the question for Mr. White, was it?
Yes, Angus White.
Yes, well, Angus White. I find that there is a very strong ethical imperative built into that system. It has to me some of the overtones of religious revivalism, which says either you are for us or against us. You are compelled to back your statements with moral imperatives, in short, to be precise. That's exactly what you asked to do. And I am far from sure whether that is an appropriate thing in management. I think that's a thing that could be, that's a question that can be discussed at great length, quite independently of the VSM. Now, which way you come down on that issue is likely to determine whether you can use the thing to complement the VSM or to say, we can't have this here. I don't think there's really anything in it at the basic level of principle which would tell you one way or the other. I think everything depends on how you propose to use it, on what force as a management device you intend to give to the moral imperatives that are implicit in the Flores suite.
Oh, thank you. Now a final question. I hope we've covered all the questioners who submitted questions. As I said, I haven't covered every question, but we've covered all the questioners. And the final question here is from Robin Wood, London Business School. He wonders about whether there is any similarity, and whether it's intentional or whether it's accidental, between the 5 systems of the viable system model and Henry Mintzberg's structure in 5s approach.
Well, the pure answer to that is I don't know. I have a lot of difficulty with Mintzberg for reasons which I suppose it's irrelevant to go into. Trying to stick to the question as posed, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to us are quite aware of the very famous paper by Miller called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And George Miller spent a lifetime analysing the variety handling capacity of the brain in certain circumstances. You see, from my point of view, when I was developing the VSM, which is a hell of a long time ago now, I could have had 50 systems that I could have identified, or I could have had 2. You have to have more than one, otherwise you're not doing anything, I suppose. For instance, I could have had the internal and the external, which would be 321 and 345, as it is. And after all, Cannon, who was the biologist who discovered the principle of homeostasis, did indeed work on the notion of an internal and external environment, which had to be in homeostatic equilibrium, each of them.
Is that Walter Cannon?
Yes, I suppose it is. Yes, indeed. So we could have had 2 systems, we could have had 50 or any number. And I got to the 5 I've got because I was well aware of George Miller's work. I know it's very difficult to get beyond the magic number 7. And I don't know if I invented this illustration, Roger, or not, but I think it's a very good way of looking at this. If you think about anything that you can quantify, then you say, well, you say to yourself, this is the average. This is sort of normal. And then you say, well, this is more and this is less, I think. So that's a threefold classification. And then you could say, well, this is a hell of a lot more and this is a hell of a lot less, and now you've got to 5. And in order to get to 7, you have to start using expletives that I would rather not put on tape, you see. You run out of a way of looking at quantity that is not numeration. But I believe that quantity is outstandingly not about numeration. That has been invented not even by mathematicians, please note, but by arithmeticians and accountants. There is more to quantification than numeration, is something I've written all my life. I'm so clear about that. So, when you come to present your insights, hopefully they are insights into the management process, and to divide them up, because you've got to divide them up, then, of course, I run into the people who accuse me of setting up hierarchies because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I call them A, B, C, D, E, I would have had the same problem. I insisted that the VSM is not a hierarchical model. Nobody believes it. Well, some people do, Roger, don't you? So, what I was saying was, I had to fix on a number of systems which were just about enough to give the discrimination that the theoretical insight required without overloading it to the point where no manager would bother with it. Now, my good friend Jim Miller, James Greer Miller, has a very famous attack on living systems, which has, I think, 20 components. And it's a very brilliant piece of work. I much admire it. But I'd never seen a manager who could cope with 20 because life's too short. So for all these kind of reasons, I'm insisting on the arbitrariness of it. I came down to these 5 because they seem to me necessary and sufficient conditions. That is the old formulation of a scientific formula, that it should offer necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, I've never asked Mintzberg how he got the 5, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same process, in which case we have a perfect example of what we call in cybernetics a cinetic variable, namely the inability of the human brain to deal with anything else.
Enrique Hernandez has a further question, slightly different in its slant, and I'd be interested in your answer, Stafford. And Enrique asks, what are the systems 4 and 5 of a tree? Or what are the systems 4 and 5 of an ant society?
Yeah, these are fascinating questions. And again, we have to be very careful to decide what we are describing, because a tree, are we talking about the one I'm looking at out of the window here now, or are we talking about the species that this tree represents? Now, if we're talking about the one outside here, it has a 3, 4, 5 capability, a metasystem, which has to do with its process of breeding, of reproducing itself, that is to say. All trees have different ways of seeding. They all have different ways of adapting to the environment, such as seeking light, growing higher than surrounding plants, spreading their leaves. Something always fascinated me about trees. If you look at them as systems for absorbing nitrogen from the atmosphere, every single tree has a unique system of spreading out to get maximum exposure. It's like a solar panel, you know. And some go in fronds and some go in platelets, and it's absolutely wonderful to walk through a wood looking at the way they do this. Anyway, that's a bit of a distraction of an aesthetic kind. What they are all doing as a tree is to try to adapt to a changing environment. And isn't it just amazing how they manage to do this when they can't even get up and walk away? Which is a way of adapting that we people are pretty used to, clearing the hell out of there. They just have to sit there, and if someone chops them down, it's too bad. But most of the trees around where we're sitting today, Roger, as you can see, there's a vast number of oaks down here who are a lot older than you and I, and will still be there when we're dead. Yeah. So that's a very interesting kind of adaptability. Now the other example,
the ants,
you see, is a different level of recursion, because we're talking about a society of ants, and not about an individual ant. And again, I've already mentioned the book you helped edit, Roger, with Raúl Espejo, wherein Richard Foss describes the application of the VSM to a beehive.
Yeah.
And it is perfectly clear that there is a level of society in which all these things operate, the 54321. So it's not amazing or confusing at all once you get the idea of recursion clear in your head. The individual ant is going to survive until he dies, and he has his 54321 going for him, but so does the colony. And the colony of bees, or the anthill of ants, will survive much longer than the individual, and the species will last longer than the particular anthill that you come along and kick over, or the bee colony that dies of killer bees, or whatever is going on. So if we get the recursive level right, then we can make this kind of analysis. And I must say that the strength of the whole theory of the VSM, which has been applied now for something like 40 years by all sorts of people, is the range of applications which have been made. It seems to me to validate the basic tenets of the VSM model, insofar as it does work for any viable system. As you know, it started with the human nervous system, but if I could just quote this... I've had a group of students, undergraduates, who've just applied the VSM for their final dissertation in the University of Swansea, and they came up, I allowed them to choose any viable system, and they all used the VSM to analyse, and I'd just like to see if I can reel this off. At the University of Wales, the college itself, those were fairly obvious, the police force of Glamorgan, the South Wales handling of the aged, the Conservative Party, the Royal Yacht Association, and McDonald's. Well, there's some of them. And I've given you a sufficiently outrageously different, from the same group of students who heard the same lectures and attended the same discussion seminars, were able to apply the VSM in all these ways, and all of them made really major discoveries about those organizations, in my opinion, as the professor concerned, but much more importantly in the eyes of the clients whom they consulted.
Once more, I want to thank Stafford Beer for his time. Finally, we hope listeners appreciate that his answers were impromptu and should not be quoted as representing his own considered opinion.